So I met Leo Dillon through my business school classmate, Firth Griffith, who was here in the front row. I was having lunch with Firth, and I told him about my interest in maps, and he told me about his cousin who had for years worked for the U.S. State Department, the part that is concerned with global border disputes, boundaries, and place names. I was especially fascinated by Firth telling me how when their families used to get together, all the kids, Firth included, would try to stump Leo with a question about places in the world, like what 8 countries border Ukraine. Leo is recently retired from the Office of the Geographer and Global Issues, U.S. Department of State. His talk is titled Cartography and Foreign Policy. Thank you very much, Leo, for joining.
Thanks for the introduction, Tom. I think you may have made one of my slides redundant there, but and thank you all of you in California for being here to see my presentation this afternoon, my virtual presentation. I wish I was there with you. And a special hi to Firth, who did in fact was the person responsible for starting this thing. So let's see. Okay, my talk's going to be about cartography, as you mentioned, in foreign policy. Let's see. Come on. Be good. There we go. All right. So maps are an important artifact and sometimes even a kind of a metaphor of a country's foreign policy. Maps can both influence a country's relations with other countries, and in turn, they are influenced by the same. So this presentation isn't meant to delve into the history of this relationship. So I'm not going to be talking about T&O maps or the British Empire's pink bits maps. Instead, I'm going to look at this issue through the lens of over 30 years of working as a geographer with the U.S. State Department. And I promise I won't make this talk all about me, but I would like to get my bona fides out of the way. I spent my career at the State Department's Office of the Geographer, first as a cartographer and eventually as the chief of the division that handles mapping, boundaries, and sovereignty issues and geographic names, as Tom said a minute ago. And indeed, these are the themes I'll be talking about today. The Office of the Geographer, which is formerly the Office of the Geographer and Global Issues, is a little-known group that has had considerable influence on the American geographic community. In addition to its cartographic responsibilities throughout the department, it's the U.S. government's authority on international boundaries and sovereignty issues, and it disseminates official international boundaries data and advises department policymakers on sovereignty and boundary issues. So the Office of the Geographer also represents the Department of State on the U.S. Board on Geographic Names, or BGN as I'll be referring to it throughout this talk. And the BGN's role is to provide standard geographic names for federal government use. And I served on this board for 25 years, twice as its chair. And my BGN service is pretty interesting, since geographic names are a fundamental element of maps, and the decisions on which ones to use can reveal the direction of a country's foreign policy. I also served recently as president of NACIS, or the North American Cartographic Information Society, a very fun and diverse community of map enthusiasts, which I recommend you check out if you don't know about them on the web at nacis.org. That's pretty easy, right? nacis.org. All right, so I said I wasn't going to get too deep into history, but I thought these 2 quotes are kind of pertinent to our topic. I think that what Napoleon said about predicting a country's foreign policy through knowledge of its geography may have made more sense in his era than it does now. But certainly a lot of foreign policy blunders have been made by not paying attention to the geography underlying a state. And as for Ambrose Bierce's quote, that's something I've always agreed with. War, which can be seen as the last resort or ultimate failure of foreign policy, suddenly brings foreign places to the attention of otherwise geographically myopic Americans. Oh, at last we have a map. Good. I know you guys are waiting for one. Here's an example that relates to both of those quotes. So World War I brought Europe into the consciousness of the average American more than anything in their living memory. It also foretold the end of the Ottoman Empire. In the post-war Treaty of Sèvres, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson sought to define Armenia's boundary with a dying Ottoman Empire, and in so doing tried to give Armenia access to the Black Sea. So the map that he drew here, and that red line represents the boundary that Wilson proposed between Armenia and Turkey. But that map didn't sit well with Turkey's emerging nationalists, and even the US Senate wasn't going to ratify it. Wilson and his State Department's superficial analysis of the region's geography misread the foreign policy imperatives of the Turks, which gives a bit of a lie to the to the quote by Napoleon. So largely because of this map and because of its implications, Turkish forces quickly overran Wilson's proposed boundary in a war that was completely disastrous to Armenia in every way. Let's see. That line that just showed up there on the right side of the map, that shows the approximate western boundary of modern-day Armenia, so you can see what they didn't get. A side note, both those maps that I just showed you were drawn by Colonel Lawrence Martin, who went on to become the State Department's first geographer and who helped establish what became the Office of the Geographer. So our office, the Office of the Geographer, originated about 100 years ago, and this map from 1922 is an early example of how cartography helped inform and even influence foreign policy. It was likely used as a briefing tool to show policymakers perceived Russian and Japanese areas of interest in East Asia. The darker shaded area showing Japanese interest in Manchuria proved to be prescient because 8 years later, after this map was made, Japan invaded and occupied much of that area. And this was a time of US suspicion of Russia's intentions, as the white and red factions there were tussling for control. Note on this map that there is no label for Russia, at least on the map itself. When we unearthed this map in the office archives, we were surprised by the label that said it was prepared in the map section of the State Department. As far as we knew, our map section wasn't formed until the late 1930s. And furthermore, we weren't really impressed by the cartography quality, and specifically if you look at how the legend covers up the letter A in the label for Siberia. So the Office of the Geographer had its heyday during World War II. At that time, we had more than 80 staff members making maps and doing geographical analysis in support of the war effort. The following maps are examples of what drove our foreign policy experts during the war. Territorial changes in Romania, territorial changes and transportation in Finland, territorial, and I put this in quotes, problems, unquote, in Xinjiang. And note how the name China also doesn't appear on the main map here. And economic activity in the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo, which we were just talking about a minute ago. Note here the name Manchukuo in quotation marks, and that is separated from China on the map by an international boundary symbol. So those are both indicators of a transitional foreign policy concerning this territory. On the one hand, the United States was not going to recognize a state formed out of an aggressive act on Japan's part, but on the other hand, Manchukuo was a de facto reality, and our relations with China at the time were uncertain. So I suspect that this map that was produced by the office in 1943 was intended to give policymakers a picture of industrial activity in a Japanese-controlled area which was not, strictly speaking, subject to the embargo of Japanese goods during the war. Note also that almost none of the spellings of place names on this map would be found on a modern-day map. That's a vestige of the romanization system for Chinese names that existed then that would change in the next couple of decades. So the placement of boundaries and sovereignty, I beg your pardon, the placement of boundaries and the display of sovereign territory are probably the most impactful ways for a state to mark out its foreign policy positions on a map. These issues bedevil private mapping companies since you can't satisfy all the parties in a boundary or sovereignty dispute on a single map. Often these companies will create different maps or mapping services for different user groups. Governments, however, don't have that luxury and must answer to foreign diplomats on their choice of boundaries and sovereignty depictions. A lot of governments get around this by simply not producing any official maps or territories beyond their borders. The United States government, however, does. And this requires very careful attention, often with convoluted results, like this one. The practice of the Office of the Geographer is to show bilaterally agreed de jure international boundaries with a solid line, and other lines of separation, such as military disengagement lines, lines of control, or unilaterally established boundaries with a dashed line. Here's an example of the Kashmir region, where scale permits, US government cartographers have to show these dashed lines with labels explaining what they are. In this case, the 1972 line of control between Pakistan and India, the Chinese line of actual control on the western side of the disputed Aksai Chin territory, and the Indian claim on the eastern side of it. Also, if you can fit them, labels denoting the smaller disputed areas along the India-China border. And if you're using color to denote countries' sovereign areas, you need to hatch those disputed areas with bands of each country's color. The placement of these lines and the language of these labels is very carefully thought out and correspond to documentation that we can point to when inevitably a foreign power formally complains about our maps, which happens all the time. So remember how I said that the US government used solid lines for bilaterally agreed boundaries only? Well, the presidential decision in 2019 to recognize the Golan Heights, cartographically at least, as sovereign territory, cartographically upended that practice. Prior to this decision, the US recognized Syrian sovereignty up to the 1949 armistice line, which you can see in the dashed line on the map on the left. After the decision, none of the new boundaries around the Golan Heights were bilaterally agreed. The former Lebanon-Syria boundary was now the Lebanon-Israel boundary, without Lebanon's consent. The former western edge of the UN disengagement zone became the Israel-Syria boundary, which Syria vehemently opposes. And the former Jordan-Syria boundary turned into a new section of the Israel-Jordan boundary without any agreement from Jordan. So the Office of the Geographer advocated that all these lines be dashed with appropriate labels, but the department policymakers insisted on portraying these areas with solid lines, contrary to our usual policy. The twilight of the Trump administration brought about another change to the US government map, the disappearance of the territory of Western Sahara. This former Spanish territory had been mostly under the control of Morocco for decades, and it was the subject of high-profile US mediation efforts led in part by James Baker. The depiction of it as a separate entity was an irritant in US relations with Morocco. But for years, our foreign policy was not to recognize Moroccan sovereignty until an agreement was reached with the government in exile of the territory. With the new recognition, suddenly the line separating them was removed, and Morocco almost doubled its territory on US government maps. Sometimes sovereignty issues need to be addressed without the use of boundaries. This is an example of guidance the office issued to denote a change in sovereignty over two islands in the Red Sea. According to the historical records in the office, the islands of Tiran and Sanafir, strategically located at the mouth of the Gulf of Aqaba, were assumed to belong to and under the nominal control of Saudi Arabia. But after the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, Egyptian forces established military control over the islands with a tacit agreement of the Saudi government. In the decades that followed, the Saudis asserted their rights to sovereignty over the islands, but since there was no written treaty assigning sovereignty, US maps showed these features as disputed. Then, to the surprise of the State Department, and I think just about everybody, Egypt returned the islands to Saudi Arabia in a 2017 agreement that established a maritime boundary. The Egyptian public was strongly against this agreement, but Egypt's highest court confirmed the agreement in 2018. And all this may seem trivial to you, two small islands sitting there, but in US government geographic databases, all polygons are assigned sovereignty values, and now these ones would have to be changed. So it's always helpful to us in the Office of the Geographer when we had plenty of notice when a new country coming into existence. However, making this map of South Sudan when it became independent in July 2011 presented several challenges. The agreement that established its independence stated that the boundary between Sudan and South Sudan would follow the January 1st, 1956 alignment found on Sudanese maps at the time. Problem, there were more than one map of that area at that time, and they didn't agree on the alignment. The office's boundary experts worked with our regional legal experts and policymakers to arrive at the boundary shown on this map, which we felt strongly reflected the de jure evidence. Problem, the South Sudanese government didn't control the disputed area in their far west, which in 1956 belonged to Bahr el-Ghazal state, which is now in South Sudan, but quickly after that, January of 1956 was transferred to Darfur state, which is now part of Sudan. So we in the office stuck to our guns based on the legal evidence, and when we were pretty dismayed when after independence, South Sudanese official maps showed the boundary favoring Sudan, effectively ceding that territory. US government maps still show the international boundary you see on this map, whereas most other maps I've seen show the other line. Other countries assert their foreign policy through mapping. China is perhaps the most aggressive with its famous 9-dash line claim to most of the South China Sea. But this line, or a set of lines, is based on a 1947 Kuomintang, in other words, Republic of China map, and was adopted and slightly modified by their rivals, the People's Republic of China. In the last few decades, this set of lines has taken on totemic status with China as it has moved to assert full control over the waters in the islands and atolls within it that it occupies. What makes China's claim notable to this presentation is its insistence that maps made in China, even for a foreign company, must portray the 9-dash line. In my role with the Office of the Geographer, we often had to field questions from other US government agencies and academic groups undergoing joint projects with China that showed maps of East Asia. They asked if it was permissible for a map in a publication with joint US-China attribution to carry China's border policy. The office said no, and in most cases, the maps were simply omitted. China carries this policy to its land boundaries as well, especially its claim to most of the Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh, which it does not control. At least one foreign company has had its maps seized by Chinese authorities for not showing China's version of its boundaries. Disclaimers are often seen on maps to warn users of limits on the accuracy or authority of the cartographic data. Commercial mapping services like Esri and OpenStreetMap have disclaimer templates for users of their data. On US government maps, there's a standard disclaimer for this purpose, which is names and boundary representation are not necessarily authoritative. The Office of the Geographer uses this disclaimer or a variation of it on any map with dashed or uncertain boundaries or where names aren't necessarily BGN approved. Disclaimers have also been used on US government maps to signal geographically related foreign policies, like this. During the latter half of the Cold War, US government maps were required to show this disclaimer on maps that depicted the Baltic region in the Soviet Union. The United States government has not recognized the incorporation of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania into the Soviet Union. As a cartographer, as a young starting cartographer, I consider this lengthy block of type to be a real inconvenience. Yet my bosses would insist on including it on even the smaller thumbnail maps we produced. At the time, I thought it was a trivial statement. But however, decades later, an Estonian colleague at the United Nations told me in a completely unprompted discussion how grateful his people were for this cartographic policy. He said it gave them hope that their status as vassal republics was temporary, and that at least one other influential country in the world thought so too. Another country whose cartographic treatment required lengthy disclaimers throughout my 34 years of service is Israel. Disclaimers on the West Bank and Gaza Strip were required during that whole period, and the one for Gaza Strip was modified after the Israeli withdrawal in 2005. The boundary experts in the office worked with the regional legal experts who wanted a much lengthier disclaimer than you see here. We pleaded with them to simplify it and ended up with this one that says, the status of the Gaza Strip is a final status issue to be resolved through negotiations. Well, we didn't like this grammatically awkward version, but we didn't argue it any further since we were afraid that if we did argue it, any other version that they decided on would be longer. We went through the same process in 2017 with the US government recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. This was a torturous process since the US government has never defined the limits of Jerusalem for sovereignty purposes. Again, our legal experts wanted a much lengthier disclaimer, and the office's boundary experts bargained them down to this one. Since it was the office's job to disseminate these required disclaimers to other US government mapping agencies, in other words, our fellow cartographers, we got a lot of unhappy growls from our interagency colleagues on this one. And note that the map shown here was produced before the US recognition of Golan Heights in 2019. That action required yet another disclaimer. So geographic names or toponyms can seem inconsequential when you see them on a map. News media agencies are free to use the spellings their editors or writers prefer, sometimes with inconsistent results. But how names are spelled and applied, or not applied, reveal choices that can be illuminating, especially in a foreign policy context. Every major language has its exonyms, which are toponyms of foreign origin that are part of that language's conventional use, like French or Spanish Londres for London, or the English Moscow for what in Russian is Moskva. The US government has a dedicated group for standardizing place names for its use, the Board on Geographic Names, or BGN. The board was formed in 1890 to address inconsistencies for domestic name places as the country expanded westward. In 1947, after 2 world wars made obvious the need for standardizing foreign names, the BGN was reconfigured as shown on this slide, with 2 major committees for domestic and foreign names, along with 2 advisory committees. The Foreign Names Committee collects official place names from foreign government sources and develops romanization systems for languages with non-Roman scripts. How does this work on a world map? Well, here's a list of country names with old and new versions, which I put in order by when the BGN considered changing them for US government use. In the case of Ivory Coast, East Timor, Cape Verde, and Swaziland, the governments of those countries officially requested that we change our usage to reflect their own language names instead of the English translation. In the case of Burma, the request was to change from one commonly locally used form, which in Burmese is Bama, to another, which was Myanmar. These are English translations. The Czech Republic formally asked us and the rest of the world to change our short form or colloquial name from Czech Republic to Czechia. The Macedonia issue was worked out through a lengthy political process. So how did the BGN respond? All of the country name changes were approved except for Myanmar. The US government remains one of the last holdouts for use of the older name Burma. This isn't a foreign policy decision. In fact, the State Department recommended the name change eventually, but rather a legislative one. Certain influential members of Congress have been holding up the name change as part of a larger package of negotiations with that country. Two notes here. The name change from Czech Republic to Czechia has proved very unpopular. For some reason, most people prefer the full name, though I would say not our cartographers, who always prefer a shorter name to fit on maps. Also, the government of Turkey has recently officially signaled its desire for other countries to use its own language name, Turkiye, in place of the exonyms used in other languages. No word yet as to whether the BGN is going to consider this request. Now let's look at city names. And I'm not picking on India here, it's just that they've had a lot of high-profile city name changes recently, so I can make a point or two here. For instance, the city of Bangalore officially changed to Bengaluru in 2014. Ahmedabad, the largest city in the state of Gujarat, is for some reason spelled Ahmadabad with an A for federal government purposes. The city of Allahabad officially changed to Prayagraj in 2018. So how popular are all these name changes? Well, let's turn to the lazy person's research tool, Google results. We can see that Bangalore still gets more than 3 times as many hits as Bengaluru. This is probably because of branding. The name Bangalore is strongly tied to its information technology sector, and most international IT users seem to cling to the older name. Ahmedabad gets more than 40 times as many hits as Ahmadabad, reflecting its local usage. And Allahabad gets more than 5 times as many hits as Prayagraj, probably because the name change is new and it hasn't had time to sink in. So, which names are BGN approved for US government use? In the first 2 cases, the BGN sided with a federal official name, even though the spelling Ahmadabad is much less popular than Ahmedabad. In the case of Prayagraj, the board is sticking for now with the old name, Allahabad. I can't say for sure why, but I suspect that there is some hesitancy in quickly changing a name of Muslim origin to a Hindi name, even if the latter was the original name of the settlement centuries ago. Now let's turn to controversial names. For international geographical features or features in dispute, users are faced with choices that can be consequential. Korea has logically named the seas surrounding its peninsula using cardinal directions, West Sea, South Sea, and East Sea. While the South Korean government doesn't have a problem with the English conventional names of Yellow Sea or East China Sea, they strongly object to the singular use of Sea of Japan and have lobbied aggressively for the inclusion of East Sea on international map labels. Problem here. The BGN has a strict policy using only one name for international sea features, a policy that the Koreans don't appreciate. In addition to the troubled history between Korea and Japan, one of the drivers of the Korean lobbying effort for dual naming is a set of small rocky islets in the middle of the sea. These islands are disputed between the 2 countries and are controlled by South Korea. The US government uses the politically neutral name of Liancourt Rocks for these features, while the Koreans use Dokdo and the Japanese use Takeshima. These tiny features have a strong emotional hold in the Korean psyche, and their efforts to challenge sole use of the name Sea of Japan has been very strong and very much ongoing. So how do media agencies under pressure from Koreans and Japanese deal with the name issue? One formulation I've seen, not a map one, but I've been seeing a lot more recently, is simply to exclude it. These news reports from a recent North Korean missile launch into the sea refer to it by direction, as in sea off the east coast of Korea or something like that. But how would you express this non-use of the word cartographically? Well, you could just not label any sea features. Some people do choose to do that. Or you can do what more and more groups are doing, which is to label both names. Still, though, it continues to surprise me that an issue like this can lead to a reduction in geographic name usage, which it actually really does. All right, let's go back to critics. Let's go back to cities and to a country that's in the news. When Ukraine was a republic of the Soviet Union, the names promulgated officially were of Russian origin. Even before the Soviet era, many of Ukraine's more familiar cities were known by their Russian forms or spellings. Upon independence in 1991, Ukraine began a process of instituting its own language forms of its toponyms, and then quickly, names familiar to English speakers changed. This table shows some of those changes. The most consequential of these is the capital and most populous city, Kyiv. The name familiar to English speakers for centuries, Kyiv, reflects the Russian spelling. Like other English language exonyms for European capitals, such as Prague, Rome, Lisbon, Belgrade, Copenhagen, and so on, Kyiv was considered by the Board on Geographic Names to be a valid conventional name. So a proposal to the board in 2006 from the Ukrainian government, with the backing of the State Department's Ukraine desk, to drop the conventional name Kyiv and use only the native form name Kyiv was rejected for that reason. Instead, the BGN took the unusual step of recommending to its agencies that they use the native name Kyiv rather than the conventional name Kiev, but we retain the conventional name Kiev anyway. The Ukrainian government, once more with the backing of the State Department's Ukraine desk, tried the same thing again in 2019. This time, with Russia having invaded and annexed Crimea and having subsequently occupied parts of the Donbas region in Ukraine's east, the board had a change of heart. It was felt that keeping the name of the capital city based on the language of a proven aggressor was indefensible, if not pejorative. The BGN dropped Kiev as a conventional name, and to my personal surprise, most English language media sources made the change shortly after that decision. Another change to place names on Ukrainian maps was the wholesale change of the Russian letter G, the Roman letter G with a letter H to reflect Ukrainian pronunciation. You can see this in the chart here in the spelling of Kirovograd, which changed to Kirovohrad. Not to be undone, 20 years after independence, Ukraine embarked on a program to rid itself of place names that were derived from Soviet or communist origins, which is why Kirovohrad, named for Bolshevik leader Sergei Kirov, was renamed to the hard-to-pronounce Kropivnitsky, I think I got that right, in 2016. This program was also how the big Ukrainian city of Dnipropetrovsk got truncated, which is now Dnipro, which refers to the Dnieper River, but on which the city sits, while Petrovsk was in reference to the Soviet revolutionary Grigory Petrovsky. So these name changes, to me, are a good example of how an important element of cartography, geographic names, is influenced by a country's foreign policy, and how the acceptance of these names, which I've noticed recently, more and more, signifies the world acceptance of a new political landscape. So thank you for sitting through my presentation. I'll answer questions in whatever remaining time I have, but if I can't get to your question, or if you think of one later, feel free to contact me at nasisleo@gmail.com.
Leo, thank you so much. We have time for a couple questions. Anybody here? Yeah.
So Leo, I have a comment and a question, I guess. One is I'm originally from Bangalore, so I still call it Bangalore. All my friends, family, we still talk about it as Bangalore, not Bengaluru. India is, again, a very rich sort of fertile ground for these name changes. Mumbai was Bombay. Calcutta was Kolkata, is now Kolkata, Madras, Chennai. I mean, we can go on and on. I think the two reasons why names were changed in India was, one, they were anglicized. It was a former British colony, and India wanted to, have their own names. But more recently, I think this is a really disconcerting thing. Like you said, regime change, foreign policy. We have this Hindu nationalist government that's in charge of India right now, and so that has a lot to do with it. I'm just wondering, have you seen other examples of this sort of thing? I mean, I feel like there are three categories. One is foreign policy. You mentioned that. One is just religious, and this third thing is this anti-colonial sort of bent. If you want to speak to any of that in other parts of the world.
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. And all three of those that you mentioned are strong drivers for changes of geographic names, and mostly with governments that think that they can that don't have a lot of accountability. Another one that I would add is commemorative naming of famous people that they want to promote. A lot of Central Asian countries, I shouldn't say a lot, certain Central Asian countries, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, are in the process of changing names that, for whatever reason, they don't want to rename them after people that their government favors in history for whatever reason, including the capital of Kazakhstan, which went from Astana. Actually, that capital had tons of different names before it was settled on Astana, and now it's Nur Sultan in honor of their former president. In the case of India, as you mentioned, there's name changes going on everywhere. The change of Allahabad to Prayagraj was considered to be a little off-putting to our State Department folks. I think I'm going kind of off topic here, or not off topic, but off record here. But I think they're just waiting to see what's going to happen here, because with the nationalist government, that's considered to be pro-Hindu and among some people anti-Muslim. The prospect of changing that name seemed a little odd, and I think there's a little wait and see kind of attitude about how that's going. Thank you. The question.
You. I have one more here, but somebody in the audience. Hold on one second.
Hi, Leo. I'm just curious how you find your people to work in the State Department. Are they promoted up from within? Are you hiring kids out of college with geography backgrounds, or how do you find future people to work in your department? Thank you.
That's also a good question. If you had someone who has a degree in cartography and has some cartographic experience, they just missed an opportunity. There were not one but two cartography positions that opened in the State Department a little bit ago in that office, less than 2 months ago. You find those, of course, by going to USA Jobs, because they're federal jobs. I got the job basically because I was in the right place at the right time, and I knew somebody who was at the State Department who I went to college with, who was there to actually modernize digitize their cartographic output. Go from pen and ink to digital cartography. And he said, "Hey, there's a position open. Would you want it?" I said, "Yeah." So I applied for it and got it. And then I learned over the many years. It's one thing about jobs like that. If you're there long enough, they'll promote you whether you like it or not. And so I stopped being a cartographer, which I really enjoyed, or did very less cartography in order to become a manager. But in the process, I learned a lot about boundaries, about sovereignty, about geographic names. A very rich environment. Otherwise, we just seek people who have that kind of experience. Our boundary expert, our current boundary expert, interned with us, and that helps a lot too. Obviously, if you go into the office, that gives you a little jump on your resume. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Leo. One more question from our Zoom audience. This is Jim Hensinger, and he asks, has the U.S. government accepted officially the place names used by the current government of Vietnam?
Yes, the answer is absolutely yes. It's rare for us, and Prayagraj, for instance, is an unusual one. And I think that eventually, if that name sticks, the BGN will approve it. We do indeed accept, even for countries where we have a troubled relationship, unless there's a really reason why not to. One of the driving principles of the board is to use local official names, and that sometimes comes into conflict. And a very good example of that is Ahmadabad. Ahmadabad is definitely the local name. The airport, the college, everything. If you go there, it's nothing but Ahmadabad. But if you look on a Survey of India map, it's Ahmadabad. Now that's the federal authority. And the state and the BGN tends to favor the federal authority because they're supposed to be the national expert, right? So with the names in Vietnam and even places where we kind of don't like those names that much, if they're official, unless there's a really good reason why not, then we will accept them. Thanks for the question.
Leo, thank you very much. This was really fascinating. We appreciate your time.